Generic Conventions, Genre Part 2. This lesson is the other side of the genre coin. It's the tail side. Completing this lesson means you're going into a coin flip with 100% certainty of winning.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the second and final lesson on genre. The previous lesson, as I alluded to in the intro, laid the foundation for this one. So make sure that you have watched and completed the activities for the previous lesson on genre before moving ahead with this one. Here are all the times the term generic conventions has appeared in past WACE exam questions between 2016 and 2022. You'll notice how not every term on this slide and the next slide uses the exact term generic conventions. Sometimes there are expectations of their genre, for instance, or genre in one part and then conventions in the other. As we'll find out later in this lesson, all of these different variations of the term generic convention are just that. They are variations of the term. They essentially mean the same thing. They require you to answer the question in the same or if not a very similar way. Here are the relevant syllabus points. As we can see, we've got 5. Not going to read through them all. You've got them in the PDF study notes. Once again, note that the term genre appears in 10 out of 40 syllabus points, and the term conventions of genres or generic conventions, something along those lines, appears in 5 of those. Lesson objectives. Firstly, we will understand the term generic conventions. Then we will do a quick revision of the term genre. After that, we'll revise the term convention that we touched on briefly in the previous lesson. From there, we will quickly revise expectation, and then we will illustrate the interplay between conventions and expectations. Finally, we'll define generic conventions and expectations of genre. From there, we'll outline conventions of each type of genre, then explain the conventions of genre of form and structure, explain the conventions of genre of subject matter, then we'll analyze a past WACE exam question, and we will do a simple summary. First main section of the lesson is understanding the term generic conventions. We looked at this term very briefly in the previous lesson. As I noted in that lesson, we're going to spend much more time on it in this one. So let's get a solid understanding of it. While the term generic conventions doesn't actually appear in the SCARSA glossary, the terms genre and conventions appear separately. As we learned in the last lesson, the term genre refers to the categories into which texts are grouped. We also saw that the etymology of the word or the origins of the word reveals that genre is a kind. Also, and perhaps more importantly, we learned that there are 2 main types of genre. Firstly, we've got genre of form and structure, and secondly, we have genre of subject matter. That is a brief recap on genre. What about this next term, convention? We defined this word in the previous lesson as something that is typically done, but doesn't have to be. The most important word in this definition is the word typically. This highlights the fact that whatever is being done doesn't need to be. It's not like there is this rule saying that things must be done. And the example that we used in the previous lesson was a non-English ATAR related example, and it was handshaking someone, giving someone a handshake. That is a convention of at least Australian society, Australian culture. When you meet someone, you shake their hand. There's no rule saying that you must do that, but it's something that is typically done. It's conventional. Here's another everyday example. It's conventional for people to brush their teeth twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. Not quite like the bear, but you get the idea. The word conventional in that sentence is used to say that brushing your teeth twice a day is common. It's an accepted practice. That's an everyday example. How about an English ATAR example? I might say it's conventional to see spaceships in sci-fi movies. Another way to say that sentence, the inclusion of spaceships is a convention of sci-fi movies. The use of the word convention in both of those examples is saying that spaceships are typically seen in sci-fi movies, but A sci-fi movie does not need to contain a spaceship for it to be classified as a sci-fi movie. A final thing I'd like to highlight from the SCARSA glossary definition is the following sentence. Conventions can be techniques, features, or elements that belong to a genre. This sentence clearly tells us the sort of things that we should be referring to when we're answering a question about conventions. We'll come back to this point shortly, but I just wanted to flag it now. The last term we're going to recap is expectation. I mentioned briefly in the previous lesson that the words convention and expectation have similar meanings. We'll delve into the similarities between these terms shortly, but let's quickly recap the definition of expectation this term first. An expectation is a strong belief that something will happen, even though it might not. Let's have a look at some English ATAR related examples of expectations. I expected the Avengers to prevail over Ultron in Avengers Age of Ultron. This was an expectation that did eventuate. Not sure if you've seen the movie, but this is exactly what happened at the end of it. There's a bad guy who's Ultron. The Avengers are the good guys. They defeat Ultron at the end of it. Another example, and this one I mentioned in the previous lesson, I expected the Avengers to prevail over Thanos in Avengers Infinity War, and this is an example that did not eventuate, as I'm sure you probably know. The interplay between conventions and expectations. The interplay, the similarities, the differences, how they relate to one another. So we know a convention is something that's typically done, and we know that an expectation is a strong belief that something will happen. What I want to emphasize is that these two meanings are basically synonymous. They're pretty much the same thing. To explain that further, if something is typically done, if it's conventional, it's likely you'll have a strong belief that it will be done. That sounds a bit abstract, so here's an example. It is a convention of the superhero movie genre for the superhero to prevail over the villain at the end of the movie. A more specific example, it is my expectation that Thor will prevail over Gore, the God Butcher, in Thor: Love and Thunder. The main point here is that although the terms might have slightly different meanings, they often produce the same examples. And those examples are the ones that we analyze and write about in English ATAR. If something is a convention, you'll likely have an expectation of that thing. Returning to the non-English ATAR example from earlier, if it's a convention to shake someone's hand upon meeting them, you might have an expectation to shake that person's hand when you meet them. Convention, expectation, basically the same thing. After all of that, we're now in a position to define both of these terms, generic conventions and expectations of genre. Before we do, you might wonder how I got from the word genre to the word generic. All you need to know for English ATAR is that the word generic is simply just an adjective of the word genre. It is a describing word for the word genre. That is why you see the term conventions of genre used in some past WACE exam questions, and then the term generic convention used in others. They mean the same thing. Another way to understand how we go from genre to generic and how generic is an adjective of the word genre is to go back to the etymology of the word genre, the origins of it, which is a kind. When we apply that definition, a kind, to generic conventions, what we get is a kind of convention, or conventions of genre, which is conventions of a kind. They're coming back to the same meaning. Here is our definition, our main definition for generic conventions, something that is typically done in a kind of text. And here is our main definition for expectations of genre. It is something that's expected to be done in a kind of text. As we can see, they're very similar. Now we're at a stage where we can hopefully see that the following terms more or less can all be understood to mean the same thing. Genre conventions equals conventions of genre equals generic conventions equals expectations of genre equals generic expectations. Moving forward, I'm just going to use this word conventions like I did for the title of this lesson, but note that it's interchangeable with the word expectations. Next main section of the lesson, conventions of each type of genre. Firstly, genre of form and structure. A few minutes ago, I highlighted this sentence from the glossary definition of conventions. Conventions can be techniques, features, or elements that belong to a genre. We're returning to it now because it tells us what the conventions of the first type of genre of form and structure, are. The sentence tells us that language features, which include language patterns and stylistic features, and structural features equal conventions of genres of form and structure. This is the table that we had an overview of from the previous lesson. It's in the PDF study notes for the lesson on genre. What this table is telling us is that genre of form and structure basically just refers to the different types of texts that you study in English ATAR. If we're to categorize them broadly, we've got visual and multimodal text and then written texts. We can further categorize those two broad categories by looking at fiction and non-fiction. And some examples, we have a novel, a documentary, a feature film, an email, everything that's on the table. Let's look at a couple of examples. The first relates to the genre of form and structure, that is feature films. For example, visual language features such as extreme close-ups, plus structural features such as shifts in time, equal features that are typically used in films, but they don't have to be. There's no rule saying that those features must be used in the genre of form and structure, that is feature films. Another example, novels. Written language features such as metaphors and structural features such as motifs equal features that are typically used in novels, but once again, they don't have to be. There's no rule saying you need to use them. The takeaway from this is that you need to learn language features. I know I've said this countless times by this stage. I'm not going to stop saying it because learning language features truly represents laying the foundation for doing well in English ATAR. Make sure you've got your system for revising those flashcards in place, whether they're the analog, physical palm cards or the digital flashcards, and don't stop revising those flashcards until you have completed the WACE exam. I promise you it'll be worthwhile. All right, they're the conventions of genres of form and structure. What are the conventions of the genres of subject matter? This trusty English textbook gives us the answer. When talking about genre of subject matter, genre conventions are the ways that narrative elements such as character, setting, plot, and themes are typically constructed within a specific type of narrative. Shout out to Year 12 English Western Australia, page 42 for the answer to that one. To be clear, this means that those highlighted narrative elements, character, setting, plot, and themes, equal conventions of genres of subject matter. And just a quick reminder that these are examples of genres of subject matter. Bildungsroman, dystopia, these are the two that we'll be looking at for examples a bit later, and then all of these other ones. Once again, these examples, this table on the slide, it's in the PDF study notes for the lesson on genre. It's all well and good to know that conventions of genres of subject matter are narrative elements relating to character, setting, plot, and themes, but that still sounds quite vague, so let's discuss some examples. I'm not going to go through examples for every genre of subject matter. If I do that, the WACE exam will come and go before we finish this lesson. Instead, what I've done is chosen two genres of subject matter that I've seen lots of schools across WA choose to focus on in the classroom. Hopefully, one of these two is relevant to you. If not, definitely still watch this lesson because the examples that I'm about to go through will help you come up with your own examples of the conventions of the genre of subject matter that you're learning in class. As already noted, the two genres of subject matter that we're going to focus on are firstly, dystopia, and then secondly, Bildungsroman. If you're studying the dystopia genre in class, you probably already know what it means. If you're not studying the dystopia genre in class, an easy way to understand the term is to just contrast it with a utopia. A utopia is simply a perfect society, whereas a dystopia is a society that is the opposite of that. As we take a look at some conventions of the dystopia genre, we're going to refer to this sample text. It's called Snowpiercer. It's been adapted into a Netflix TV series. In my opinion, the movie is much better, and it is actually one of my favorite movies of all time. The trailer is in the resources tab below this video, so pause the video lesson now, go take a look, and come back once you're done. Hopefully you picked up from the trailer that the general gist of the movie is that a train houses what's left of humanity after an environmental apocalypse. There's a dictatorial government that tries to maintain a balance, which, in the eyes of that government, means that the rich occupy the front end of the train and then the poor occupy the back end of the train. The occupants of the back end of the train don't like the government very much. Let's relate this to some conventions. Firstly, character conventions. It's conventional for dystopian texts to have a character that's fed up with the status quo. In Snowpiercer, this is relevant because Curtis, who's played by Chris Evans, the dude who plays Captain America, is sick of living in the squalid tail end of the train, the back end. Another character convention of dystopian texts is that the character believes there's a better alternative to the way things are. Curtis believes a better alternative to living in the tail end is to start a revolution against Wilford, the operator of the train, and his underlings. A third character convention of dystopian texts is that the character sacrifices a lot in order to carry out their mission. At one point in the movie, Curtis decides to capture Wilford's second in charge at the expense of his own comrade's life. What about setting? What is the setting of a dystopian text typically like? The setting is post-apocalyptic. In Snowpiercer, the year is 2031, almost 2 decades after an attempt to stop climate change via a stratospheric aerosol injection, definitely have to look that one up, which catastrophically backfires and creates an ice age. Another one, there's a heavy focus on decay and loss. In Snowpiercer, billions of people died as a result of the attempt to stop climate change, leaving only the passengers of the train. Finally, there's omnipresent surveillance. Omnipresent just means everything, everywhere, all at once. Foreshadowing. In Snowpiercer, there are security cameras monitoring almost every inch of the train. What typically happens in the plot of a dystopian text? An extreme power imbalance exists between 2 groups of people. In Snowpiercer, the elite live in the front end of the train and the poor live in the tail end. An oppressed group of people band together to overthrow the totalitarian government. In Snowpiercer, the passengers at the tail end of the train are united by Curtis and they start a revolution at an opportune moment. Lastly, we have an oppressed group of people prevails, but at a significant loss. In the movie, lots of people die in the final act as a result of Curtis's revolution. Themes. What are some themes that typically pop up in dystopian texts? Government control. In Snowpiercer, Wilford and his underlings control everything in the train, like the provision of food and water. Environmental disaster. In Snowpiercer, the attempt to fix climate change causes an ice age. Survival. Curtis and his fellow tail enders revolt because they believe it's necessary for their own survival. Those are some conventions of the dystopia genre. Just to be clear, this isn't an exhaustive or complete list of all the conventions of the genre, because such a thing doesn't exist. I'll get to that a bit later on, but in the meantime, these examples give you a good idea of the sort of things that you should be looking for when you're analysing the conventions of your own genre of subject matter, if it isn't dystopia. The next genre of subject matter we're going to discuss is Bildungsroman. If you're not studying this one in class, you are probably wondering what on earth the word means. Quite simply, Bildungsroman is a German word and can be understood by breaking it up into 2 parts. Bildung means education, formation, growth, and Roman just means a novel. If we combine those 2 terms, we get a novel about education, formation, and growth. The text we're going to refer to is the Hunger Games series. Technically, it's multiple texts. If you're unfamiliar with the story, there's a link in the resources tab below the video that provides an excellent synopsis of the first movie. Anyway, Wikipedia gives us the following synopsis of the series. The Hunger Games universe is a dystopia set in Panem, a North American country consisting of the wealthy capital and 13 districts in varying states of poverty. Every year, children from the first 12 districts are selected via lottery to participate in a compulsory televised battle royale deathmatch called The Hunger Games. And yes, this text can still be classified as a dystopian one, but we're focusing on the elements of it that relate to the Bildungsroman genre. What is the protagonist typically like in this genre? The character is typically quite rebellious. Maybe you can relate to this one. Katniss Everdeen is our protagonist throughout the trilogy. At the start of it, she is 16 years old, hunts for food and sells it on the black market, and that is an act that's punishable by death. The character doesn't conform to societal norms. Maybe you can relate to this one too. Katniss doesn't subscribe to her celebrity status after winning the first Hunger Games. Another convention, the character makes discoveries about the adult world. In the Hunger Games, Katniss discovers harsh truths about the Capitol. For instance, its corruption and the ulterior motives of President Snow. What is the setting typically like in a Bildungsroman text? One setting at the beginning of the story. I know this one might sound obvious, but bear with me. In the Hunger Games, the story begins at District 12. Another convention, we've got an entirely different setting for the rest of the majority of the story, where the character undergoes their transformation. In the Hunger Games, the majority of the trilogy revolves around the Capitol. And lastly, a return to a setting that's similar to the setting at the start of the story. The Hunger Games trilogy ends with Katniss and Peter starting a family in District 12. So there's typically a circular aspect to the setting of a Bildungsroman text. And that circularity is a device that facilitates or helps the character's transformation. How about plot? What typically happens in the plot of a Bildungsroman text? Normally, there's some kind of inciting incident that propels the protagonist into their journey. In the Hunger Games, Katniss's younger sister, Prim, is chosen as the female tribute for District 12. That causes Katniss to volunteer as tribute in her place. What a classic moment. I remember I was in year 9 when I saw this in the cinema, and it hit me hard. Another convention, we've got the protagonist faces a number of conflicts, i.e. the transition from childhood to adulthood. In the Hunger Games, these conflicts represent the entire trilogy, as Katniss goes from one Hunger Games to the next, and finally leads an uprising against the Capitol. The protagonist eventually finds their place in society. In the Hunger Games, Katniss ultimately settles down with Peter in their hometown, District 12, after bringing down the Capitol. Last but not least, what themes are typically found in Bildungsroman texts? Conformity. One of the obvious harsh rules is that the districts must offer up 2 tributes for each year's Hunger Games. Another theme, self-discovery. In the Hunger Games, in a paradoxical way, Katniss's journey of self-discovery centers on the fact that she can bring about change by maintaining her sense of identity and integrity. Freedom/escape. Katniss's mission is to free herself and all the districts from the tyranny of the Capitol. Alright, we've just looked at examples of conventions of the genres of form and structure and conventions of the genres of subject matter. What we're going to do now is look at a past exam question to see how we can apply what we've just learned. This is the question we're going to analyze. Explain how at least one text conforms to generic conventions while still challenging its audience. What we're about to discuss only addresses the generic conventions part of the question and not the while still challenging its audience part. The purpose of Module 2 is to go in depth on the concepts. The purpose of Modules 3 to 5 will show you how to address every single part of the question. In this lesson, we're focusing on generic conventions, so we're just going to focus on that term in this question. The text we're going to refer to is The Matrix. If you haven't seen it, go do yourself a favor and watch it. It's easily in my top 5 of all time, plus it has Keanu Reeves. Firstly, let's make sure we understand the relevant part of the question, which is conforms to generic conventions. We know from the previous lesson that conforms basically means to comply with or follow. And we know from earlier in this lesson that the term generic conventions refers to things that are typically done in a kind of text or genre. If we're going to analyze what things are typically done in a genre, we obviously need to know which genres The Matrix falls within. So our genre of form and structure is a feature film. The Matrix is a movie. And our genre of subject matter is dystopia, but it can also fall into sci-fi and action and probably a few others. definitely go check out the scene that we're going to analyze. It's in the resources tab below the video. So pause this video lesson now, go watch the scene, come back once you're done. What I want to do now is discuss two approaches, not the only two, to this question. While I outline these approaches, I'd like you to think about which one would be the best in the marker's eyes. Approach number one involves, firstly, outlining the conventions of the dystopia genre, and two, describing how those conventions manifest in the text. Let's see what an excerpt of a response that follows that approach could look like. The Matrix conforms to the conventions of the dystopian genre. One such convention is a post-apocalyptic setting. At one point in the film, Morpheus tells Neo almost everything about the Matrix and how it came to exist. Morpheus explains that at some point in the 21st century, humans created an artificial intelligence that relied on solar power to operate and eventually turned against the human race. He further explains that, in an attempt to destroy the machines, the physical embodiment of the AI, humans scorched the sky so they would have no solar power and be destroyed. That's approach number one. This is approach number two. It involves outlining the conventions of the dystopia genre and then analyzing how those conventions are depicted in the text with reference to conventions of genre of form and structure, for instance, visual language features and structural features. The first step between both approaches is the same. The second step is different. And this is what a response following the second approach could look like. The Matrix conforms to the conventions of the dystopian genre. One such convention is a post-apocalyptic setting. The setting is conveyed in a pivotal scene of the film where Morpheus explains to Neo how the Matrix came to exist. At one point in the scene, an extreme long shot depicts a bleak cityscape consisting of countless dilapidated skyscrapers. Various hues of black and grey are utilised in the shot to highlight the sheer absence of life. Diegetic sound in the form of thunder and non-diegetic sound in the form of a violin work in conjunction with the aforementioned techniques to create a tense mood and underscore the post-apocalyptic nature of the world in which the story takes place. Comments. Which one do you think a waste marker would give more marks to? Hopefully you were thinking approach number two takes the cake. If I were to ask you why approach number two is better, I wouldn't blame you if you just said because it uses fancier words or something like that. And you would actually be pretty close to hitting on the nail with that answer. Approach number two is better because a complete answer to a question like this about genre requires reference to both types of genre, form and structure, and subject matter, not just one or the other. Bearing this in mind, in approach number one, I only referred to a convention of the genre of subject matter, which is a post-apocalyptic setting. And I didn't mention anything about conventions of film, which are visual language features. As a result, in approach number one, I failed to discuss the genre of form and structure, and therefore haven't fully addressed the genre part of the question. Approach number two is better because it discusses how this particular convention of the dystopian genre is depicted in the film through the use of conventions of film, visual language features. Another way to think about the difference between approach number one and approach number two is that the former just describes how a post-apocalyptic setting exists in the Matrix, whereas the latter analyzes how a post-apocalyptic setting exists in the Matrix by referring to the language features that are used to create that setting. Analyzing always trumps describing. The last thing I want to highlight is that conventions of genre of subject matter aren't set in stone and can be worded in a variety of ways. I alluded to this key takeaway earlier in the lesson, and what I mean by this is that there is no right or wrong way to name a convention. For example, I could say post-apocalyptic setting, I could say post-societal setting, I could say a bleak setting, I could say grim setting. All of these examples could be used interchangeably. The point here is that your focus shouldn't be on how you name the convention, but rather your explanation of how the convention is depicted in the text with reference to language features. That is all the main content of the lesson. Let's go through a simple summary of it. First main part of the lesson, we looked at understanding this term generic conventions. Firstly, we focused on genre and we revised our definition of genre from the previous lesson, which is the categories into which texts are grouped. Then we revised our definition of convention, and that is something that's typically done but doesn't have to be. We also revised our definition of expectation, which is a strong belief that something will happen, even though it might not. Then we looked at the interplay between conventions and expectations. We learned that if something is typically done, it's likely you'll have a strong belief that it will be. It's likely you'll expect that thing to be done. From there, we looked at the terms generic conventions and expectations of genre. A definition for generic conventions was that it is something that's typically done in a kind of text. Our definition for expectations of genre is something that is expected to be done in a kind of text. Finally, in this part of the lesson, we saw that the terms generic conventions, conventions of genre, generic conventions, expectations of genre, generic expectations, they all basically mean the same thing. The next main section of the lesson discussed conventions of each type of genre. For genre of form and structure, language features and structural features equal the conventions of genres of form and structure, i.e. they're the conventions of multimodal and visual text and written texts. For the genre of subject matter, narrative elements such as character, setting, plot, and themes equal the conventions of that type of genre. Then we looked at some specific conventions for two genres of subject matter. Some conventions of the dystopia genre, character is fed up with a status quo, setting it's post-apocalyptic, plot an extreme power imbalance exists between two groups of people, and theme, government control. Some conventions of the Bildungsroman genre, character, the protagonist is rebellious, setting, there's a change from one setting to another and then back again. Plot, there's some kind of inciting incident that propels the protagonist into their journey. And theme, conformity. Last main section of the lesson looked at a past WACE exam question. We looked at two approaches in relation to the matrix scene. And we learned that approach number 2 is the one we want to use. Approach number 2 involves outlining the conventions of the genre of subject matter and then analyzing how those conventions are depicted in the text with reference to the conventions of the genre of form and structure. And those conventions are written or language features and structural features. It's this second point where the majority of the marks are. This second point really represents that distinction between description and analysis. We always want to go for more analysis than description. That's why approach number 2 was better than approach number 1, because approach number 2 involved more analysis. Approach number 1 just involved lots of description. The final point in this part of the lesson was that conventions of genre of subject matter aren't set in stone and they can be worded in a variety of different ways. For instance, a post-apocalyptic setting or a grim setting, you can use either of those words to describe the setting. What matters is your analysis of that setting in the relevant text. That is all for this lesson on generic conventions, and that wraps up our discussion of genre. I know that was a lot, but at this stage, you probably know just how important genre is in English ATAR. It comes up in a quarter of the syllabus points. It's going to come up in your WACE exam. You need to know about it. So well done for getting through this lesson and the previous one. Make sure you go and complete the workbook activities for this lesson. They build off the activities that you completed for the previous lesson on genre, and they get you back to completing some text tables. All the best with that, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Until then, keep it simple.